Welcome to Why Is This Good? A podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine and I'm here with John. Hey, John.
Hello.
All right, John, it's your turn. Tell us about your story.
I picked a story called The Worshipful Society of Glovers by Mary Robinette Kowal.
In a publication called Uncanny, a magazine of science fiction and fantasy.
Yes. I realized we'd done a few science fiction stories, but I was like, I want to do a good fantasy story.
That's not Tolkien.
And it's not Tolkien. Oh, yeah, we did do that Niggle story.
Yeah.
But my wife and I have read a bunch of Mary Robinette Kowal's novels, and I was like, I like her as a writer. Let's see I know she's been nominated for like Hugos and Nebulas and stuff, so I figured I'd look into her short fiction.
What section are you going to read for us?
I was going to read the section where he gets robbed. To make up for being tardy, Vaughn worked well past his usual time. It was full dark by the time he left the shop, locking the door behind himself. His eyes blurred when he tried to look in the distance, so the candles in the windows turned into dancing globes like will-o'-the-wisps come to the city. He had the pieces for another set of gloves folded in paper in his pocket and had snuck the little shears out of the shop. Sarah would be worried about him, but she knew well enough that the master had say over his time. Tucking his hands in the sleeves of his overgown, Vaughn hurried for home. If he was lucky, the pie shop would still have something, otherwise it was yesterday's bread for dinner. Before he even got out of the alley, a hand clamped down on his shoulder with the weight of iron. Vaughn gasped and tried to wrench free, but the man's fingers dug in, unnaturally strong. His vision went white and red. He dropped to his knees, grabbing by instinct at the source of the pain, and touched leather. A glove of smooth oxskin, embroidered at the knuckles with fool's knots and chains. Strength gloves. I've got nothing. Vaughn stopped struggling, but the scoundrel's grip on his shoulder didn't lighten. Lord, they'd break his shoulder at this rate. At least it was his left. He could still stitch if they didn't hurt his right. What a stupid thing to worry about when he might not live through the night. Vaughn knelt on the cold cobblestones with one knee in a puddle of something. Don't try anything. I won't. Who had made the man's gloves? Vaughn kept his head down as the fellow released him. Partly this is so he didn't look like a threat, but also so he could see the gloves. Bright red oxskin with the requisite fool's knots and chains stitched at the knuckles. The man yanked his pocket off his belt, likely harder than the man had intended, and the cloth split down the seams. Green thread marched up the sides of the gloves in flames that looked like it had come out of Master O'Connell's shop. Not that it mattered. Like as not, they were stolen. Sumptuary laws being what they were, someone of their station couldn't afford a pair of gloves, much less flaunt them. Heavens no. If they were something so fine, someone might mistake them for nobility. Ha! The thief dug through the shredded pocket and found Vaughn's meager purse. Thank heavens he hadn't been paid yet this week. But there went any chance of buying Sarah a pie for dinner. When the thief drew out the leather for the gloves, Vaughn groaned. Please, those aren't ensorcelled yet. It's just leather and... The thief threw the kid skin on the ground. Right in the puddle Vaughn knelt in. Bollocks. Even if the liquid were by some miraculous chance pure water, the leather would warp and stiffen. Master Martin would take it out of his wages. The man found the little silver shears and tucked them away. Small though they were, a pair of silver shears were worth more than Vaughn would make this month. Thank God he'd already hawked his father's snuff box, or that would be gone as well. That's it? The thief grabbed him by the collar. I'm a journeyman. You don't dress like one. My master wants us to look smart for his customers. He'd near beggared himself meeting the requirements of the journeyman contract, but it was the only way to advance in the guild. If he were wearing a cot, as he had most of his life, the thief wouldn't have looked at him twice. If you thought I was a nobleman, I am sorry to have wasted your time. Guess I'll take your overgown and hat for my troubles. He snatched the hat off Vaughn's head. Please, I'll lose my place if I'm not. Your place or your life. Either way, they're mine, ain't they? The thief clapped his hands together, and the threads glimmered with the spellwork caught in them. Off with your overgown. What choice did Vaughn have? He shrugged off the overgown, and though it was tempting to throw it in the puddle, same as the leather, he wasn't a fool. He handed it over, jaw clenched, to keep from crying as the thief threw the overgown across his arm. It wasn't fair. He'd worked so hard to get here, to make something of himself, and... The thief's free hand drew back, curling into a fist. If that connected, Vaughn was a dead man. He threw himself back. The blow whistled past his face, just brushing his cheek. Even that fleeting contact lit the night sky for a moment. Then his head smacked against the cobbled street and everything went dark.
Well, I feel like an idiot, but when I read this, it took me forever to figure out if it was sci-fi or fantasy. And it wasn't until like in hindsight, the scene that you read is like the first indication that the gloves that they're making are the things that have the actual power, you know?
Yeah, I felt similarly. That was like the scene where I really was like, oh, okay, now I know what's happening.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I read the whole like scene that you just read, and I still was kind of like, oh, maybe like this is stupid, but like I kept thinking if maybe this guy's wearing strength gloves because he's so strong, not like that the gloves themselves are like making him strong, you know? I thought like they're just like a
Um,
badass, like a bunch of badass like bodybuilders like running the streets, like, and they wear those gloves because they plan on like manhandling people or something. Yeah, that's like literally what I was thinking. And then it like I think like I said when it did kind of come together for me it was when he was finally calling up that little fairy thing. What are their names?
oh, the brownies?
Yeah, the brownies. I was like, what are these brownies? So he calls up a brownie to help, you know, make this bizarre deal
Yeah.
where he's going to make the brownie some gloves and then the brownie's going to make gloves for his sister. And that was when I really felt like an idiot because then I understood why his sister needed gloves in the first place and that they were going to help her with these seizures, you know?
Yeah.
I didn't understand that those were the key to her healing. I didn't understand until really the end that these gloves had a variety of powers that way, right? And I was trying to think of other types of fantasy novels, and I'm sure there's tons that I'm just not well read in this genre, where something like a physical object like gloves can not only make you stronger, but also heal something. You know, these gloves can, it seems like you could come up with a type of glove for almost anything that you wanted to solve or improve. And that was kind of interesting.
And she includes a lot of examples in the
Yeah.
narration. Like as they're walking down, he sees because he's learning the craft, he notices everyone's gloves and he's like, oh, that person has chastity gloves. And that
Yeah.
person has gloves for some other thing. Oh, the one woman had gloves that would make her be able to have kids
Yes.
later in life.
Yeah, that was funny. I think they were both like next to each other. It's like, oh, those are horror gloves, and those are please knock me up gloves. Yeah, so I think, and it might have been that scene too. I'm like forgetting like the order all these scenes are in, but it was a slow build for me to figure
Yeah.
out like what genre we were in.
Well, there was a scene where he met the brownie that worked with his master was earlier in the story than the one he summoned.
Yeah,
But that's actually one of the things the thing that I really want to comment on for this story was how she does the learning curve of this story. It feels really steep, right? But what she's doing, like she's setting the scene, she's setting the milieu, you know, the whole world that they're in and the rules of that world through the beginning of the story. And it's still, you know, you're still learning things as you're going to like very much of it. And that's an interesting feature. Like when we read Hemingway, we don't have to learn about the world, you know. He will put us in Paris, he'll put us in Africa, but we know basically what's going on. Whereas a story like this, you really I wonder sometimes like some people don't like reading fantasy stories
yeah,
because I think it requires it can require a different mindset going into it. Like, okay, I have to assume nothing and learn everything.
yeah,
Right. The story is going to teach me how to read it. It's going to teach me
yeah,
what the world it looks like. You know, she sets it in London. So it's kind of like
yeah.
historical fantasy,
Right.
like London during a certain era during King
Felt like
Henry's reign.
felt like steampunk.
Yeah, like a little bit like obviously a couple centuries before what's traditionally steampunk, but that kind of like historical moment with some added
Yeah,
steampunk is technology, added magic
yeah,
in this case, that changes the world in subtle ways. So you not only have to orient yourself in a historical period, you have to orient yourself in
right.
a magically altered period, which just requires like a blank slate. You know, you have to let go of your preconceptions. And so when you read different things, like these gloves hadn't yet been ensorcelled, you're like,
Yeah,
what does that mean? You can, you know, if you're reading literary fiction, you would know. You can just
right.
guess, like, oh, is that a metaphor or something?
Yeah,
But in this case, that has a real specific in-world meaning. Like these gloves
yeah.
are ordinary and they don't have magic in them yet. You have to learn that as you're going.
Yeah, it was cool to like you said, steampunk is from a different era entirely, but it like mixes the fact that we're going to go back in time, but also
Yeah.
add this like technology that doesn't exist now, whether it's technology or magic. You know what I mean? It's not like Harry Potter where it's like, okay, modern day London
Yeah.
and we're going to add magic. It's like we're going to go back in time and make them more sophisticated somehow. It's cool.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that's why people really enjoy fantasy is just seeing different settings and different like possibilities.
I think, like I said, maybe like a more astute reader would have picked up on what was fantasy faster. But I'm reading this and I'm like, oh, a journeyman must be someone that used to make gloves in London. Like I'm like reading all these things. I'm like, I don't know what's like historically accurate, and I don't know what's like invented yet. You know,
Oh, that's true because
it took
this
me a
is
while.
built. That's the guild system of the time.
Yeah,
Where you didn't get a regular job, you would go and
yeah.
be a journeyman and learn.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
thought I was learning a lot about glove making for a long time.
you
Yeah.
did. I think that's one of the great things about stuff like this is like,
Yeah.
and she puts in a lot of details about what
Yeah.
it means to make gloves and stuff, and then adds the little extra about making magic as part of them too.
Yeah, because there's parts of this that are obviously accurate. Like they talk about like dropping the leather in the water and how it's like ruined now because it's going to shrink. So she
Yeah.
didn't write this knowing nothing about actual gloves. And then, the stitching and all of the embellishments and things. And yeah, it felt authentic that way. It wasn't like they were making a type of clothing we've never heard of or seen. It was interesting too because they like at the end introduced the concept. The brownie is kind of like threatening the guy. He's like, we're making a deal now for these gloves for your sister, but I guarantee you'll need my help again when they wear out, which is like another interesting little wrinkle because for the whole story, he's been talking about how he needs to learn how to make these gloves. And then when he finally gives up on being able to make them himself in time for them to help her, and he cuts this like shady little deal, kind of at the expense of his career potentially, you think like, that's all he needs to do, and then he's done. And then the brownie's like, yeah, just so you remember, gloves don't last. And then I was like, oh my God, this guy is like, this is like a temporary deal with the devil, like he's gonna have to, I don't know. That was really stressful.
Yeah, I love how, all of you can strip away all the fantasy, all the setting, the interesting things, and at heart, it's still the story of a person making a choice and then
Yeah.
following out the consequences of that choice. And like, so he makes a particular choice that just ruins his life.
Right.
He gets what he wants, but not really.
Yeah.
You could set that in any kind of situation, and this happens to be set into a fantasy world. I think like a lot of people denigrate fantasy as being like it's not like real literature, but this is the kind of thing like you can really get at the human condition,
Yeah.
irrespective of the setting.
I mean, it's weird that people feel that way because if I can cry reading any kind of genre,
Yeah.
and then it's fiction, it's writing, it's good.
Yeah. And one thing that I really like about fantasy is you can turn the dials in different ways that you can't do in literary fiction.
Seeing that this was a publication that publishes both sci-fi and fantasy, I was thinking a lot about like the distinction between those. Because, okay, we talk a lot about sci-fi and there's a broad range of sci-fi. There's sci-fi that is so accurate that it inspires actual spacesuits. You know what I mean? And then there's sci-fi that goes so far into the future, but like along some kind of line where it's believable, or maybe we don't have the technology yet, but you could see it going that way, whatever it is. And then fantasy, it's like, oh, you don't have to there's no rules, but it's not crazy to think that you could make gloves with technology that does something, right? They're not talking about like computers and chips in these gloves. They're talking about magic, but like at some level, the sci-fi that they're talking about is magical, right? Because it doesn't exist. We don't know how to do it. So it's weird where that kind of like distinction is. Like you could say like dragons don't exist, so they're fantasy. But we're about to like clone a fucking woolly mammoth. So is it sci-fi? I don't know.
Well, I mean, in fiction, the dragon, it serves a function to the story, right? You can make the dragon a character, you can make the dragon a threat, you can make the dragon whatever it happens to be. You could ride a dragon, but you can also ride some sort of science fiction-y thing that serves the same function as a dragon, like
Yeah.
I would put science fiction, fantasy, and I think this is just in general, a lot of other genres as well, under this, they call it speculative fiction.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
just
right.
you're going beyond what you see out the window, what the real
Right.
world seems to have in it, and you're positing other things. And you pull in fantasies from other cultures or
Right.
just mythologies from other cultures. You can call
Yeah.
that fantasy, or you can call it like,
Or you could call it religion.
there you go, religion. Yeah, there's
Yeah, speculative fiction is obviously, yeah, that's an umbrella that I'm comfortable with. But like
Yeah.
then you think about it, like, I don't know, like Jurassic Park is sci-fi.
Yeah. Well, it's science fiction, except you have to, then you say, but at what point does the fact that DNA can't survive for millions of years make that a fantasy because
That's
you're
what I mean.
relying on some kind of magical thing that happened?
Yeah, and it's like I know that there are other like types of stories that like live in this space between the two. Now I'm like really
Uh,
curious to see what those are.
Well, this kind of historical fantasy is really, I haven't, don't read a lot of it, but I think it's really popular. I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
people doing historical fantasy. And I mentioned, taking fantasies from other cultures. I think there's a lot of people who do that too. Like there will be a writer who has an Indian background. And so they bring stuff from India into
Right.
a fantasy setting, or there's a different cultures have different stories in their background. So they bring creatures from those stories into
Yeah.
modern urban fantasies, and it's so interesting. There's lots of stuff you can explore, but it's all, you just put it in an umbrella term. You're just making reality, you're augmenting reality in some way, either through
Yeah.
science, through fantasy, through made up stuff or potential stuff that hasn't been invented yet.
Yeah, I credit like this podcast having done it, for as long as we have, with like really introducing me to sci-fi and making me realize that I do like it, because it's
Yeah.
sci-fi is one of those things where, especially if you're not a reader, you probably reduce it to sci-fi is Star Wars. Fantasy is Lord of the Rings. Like, if I were to ask my dad, name a fantasy story, these are like the most popular ones. And so you end up like thinking in these like kind of rigid boxes, like sci fi must be outer space. And then when you start really reading like sci fi stories, you realize it's like any kind of technology. It can be like this chat GPT stuff and like AI and robots and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't have to be on Saturn or a planet, Tatooine, you've never heard of. And then like a story like this with the fantasy, like it's embarrassing, but this is like the first time that I've read something where it's not on its face fantasy because there's not something like a dragon or a hobbit or a creature you've never heard of like slapping you in the face on the first page.
Yeah.
It takes a while for you to realize that like obviously the fantasy is strong in this, right? Brownies and all this kind of
Oh,
stuff.
yeah.
It's obviously
Magic
fantasy.
gloves.
Yeah, but it's not as fantastical. It's not as outrageous as like you said there's world building here, but this is set in London. So there is that like historical. This was enlightening for me, which is embarrassing.
Yeah.
Because I know there's hardcore fans of this genre that are like, yeah, we know. We've been doing cool shit like this for a long time. But it's just cool to still be able to be introduced to like a new little type of writing that I can get into.
Yeah, the genre blending stuff is really that's huge. It has been
Yeah.
huge for the past couple like decade or 2 decades. The fantasy market has grown and shifted in the past since Tolkien kind of made
Yeah.
it saleable. And so it's kind of exploded and then people are just trying things out and it's really wonderful. But what you were saying before about when you start reading this and it's like set in London and
Yeah.
like that's my takeaway for the story is about the learning curve and establishing because she sets up the scene, the setting, the
Yeah.
character, all the threads get established in the beginning. Like any story is going to start
Yeah.
with character and setting and stuff like that. But here she's also setting up the world at the same time. So all of those threads have to come in at the same time. You can't come in with as many assumptions as you
Right.
would or a quote unquote literary fiction.
Right.
When we talked about earlier how it took a while to figure out what was going on when we first read it, and then when I reread it, I was like, oh, everything's right here. How did I miss it
Yeah.
all?
Yeah.
I think that's one of those things that comes in, like when you're reading fantasy. As an experienced reader of fantasy, you would know how to read those clues more
Yeah.
easily than like I've read so much literary fiction recently that I don't necessarily
You're not primed for that.
I'm
Yeah.
not primed for it anymore. Or I used to when I read more fantasy.
I feel that way about mystery.
Oh yeah, because when you read a mystery, you know what you're supposed to start looking for. Like you gotta start looking for clues right away, right? Part of my takeaway is like what she's doing in this is she's starting it with a scene. Like we always say, it's
Yeah.
what you want to do is you want to start with scene because that's the best way to introduce the reader to something. And then when he's going out into the streets of London on his way to work, that's when he starts seeing gloves everywhere, and so we start to learn about the gloves in those situations. And like as a not an experienced fantasy reader, the first time I read this, I hate saying that, but I can't call myself an experienced fantasy reader anymore. I
Really?
think I don't read enough of it. But an unexperienced fantasy reader is not necessarily going to know to pay attention to that stuff as closely, right?
Right.
A pair of gentlemen wearing green antler gloves for hunting. Like that's, oh, what does that mean? I'm gonna have to learn about that. You're just learning stuff throughout all of it as you're watching the characters deal with the situation that's been introduced.
Right.
So you could call it a steep learning curve, and I think that's just going to be the nature of the kind of fiction that's being done, because the author is required to rewrite the rules of the entire world.
Yeah.
Except for certain things that they manage to keep. Like, does gravity still work the way it does? Like, is down still down? You can't take that for granted. but we're in London, so okay.
She does it pretty, yeah, right. We have something to hold on to here. She does it pretty deftly, but I think about like if this were YA, maybe there would be this paragraph very early on that says Bond made magic gloves.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It'd spell it out for you.
Summarizing kind of situation.
Right. Which I don't hate, but what I really enjoyed about this was just kind of being along for the ride and being invested in him before I fully understood necessarily what the rules were.
Yeah, it's a difference between an essay and a story, right? Fiction.
Yeah.
You want to get into the world, not be told about the world.
Exactly. And that's, I think, I remember reading Practical Magic in a book club, and I wanted to kill myself because it was all about explaining the world. The entire book was explaining the world. And it would literally have a paragraph halfway through the book that was like, so-and-so, a witch, saw a swarm of bees. Bees in this world mean an omen. And I was like, just show it, it was miserable. It was like reading footnotes. The entire book. Terrible. It was awful.
Do you have a takeaway?
Yeah, my takeaway is mostly what I was talking about before, which is like, this is the first time I've thought about combining these genres or blurring the lines a little bit and like not really worrying how you're going to classify it if you write it. And I'm not one of these people that comes up with super imaginative plots or situations, really. Like I am very much writing like the literary fiction stuff, but I like the idea that there's this space in the middle. We talk a lot about how if you enjoy writing something and you're having fun writing it, just like keep doing it because that'll come through. And we've talked about that with like sci-fi and fantasy, I'm sure, specifically and separately, but this seems like a new level of just don't worry about it. Like don't worry about where you might publish this even. Just if you have a cool idea, just go with it.
And if you want to call it literary, just call it magical realism.
There you go.
It's literary.
Wow. There's a lot of little tricks.
That's right. I think there's other qualities that go along with that, more or less. You can introduce magical things that are fantasy, right? And then it's a literary genre in other ways.
Right. Yeah, and maybe the other takeaway would just be for me, which is that I liked this and could see myself like reading maybe other things specifically to start with from this magazine, where it's like going to be a little bit of both. Or like modern day fantasy outside of dragons is interesting. All right, well, thanks, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us keep the show running. Find out more at patreon.com/whyisthisgoodpodcast. And for industry news, writing tips, and great short fiction, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Naples Writers Workshop. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter at napleswritersworkshop.com.